Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's virtual program with Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. My name's Cal Penn. I'm delighted to be here with my friend Huma Abedin for a conversation about our new books, You Can't Be Serious and Both and A Life in Many Worlds. Just a reminder, if you have a question for either of us, please submit those in the chat or the comment section. Huma, welcome.
Cal, I am so excited to be in conversation with you. And I just think it's amazing happenstance that we both have our books coming out at the same time. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Same here. I've been seeing you everywhere the last couple of weeks, especially the last week and a half. I know we had the same pub date, and I have been so excited to hear you tell your story. And I'm just going to brag a little bit because you sent me an early copy of the book, and I was thumbing through just the photos at first, and it's like it's the same photos that I have in my book of the immigrant parents and the 70s, 80s attire and the trips to South Asia. And it's just like, I was so excited for this because I feel like that experience of at least what I felt was boundless possibility as a kid, going into this unlikely journey of entering worlds, mostly entertainment and then dabbling in public service. You've had this whole lifetime of public service. Were the parents an influence? What was the big it that got you in there?
Cal, I want to gush about you for a minute because I just want to tell you.
Do that about you. Okay.
Look, these are my notes.
Oh my gosh.
I compared early family photos. I loved your book. I loved your book so much. And I feel like, we've known each other in politics. I've obviously seen you, I've watched your shows. I know you're, super famous, but your story, I just opened the book and I couldn't put it down. I thought, I'm on a book tour. There's not a lot to do aside from reading my own book and preparing. And I think anyone who's watched any of my interviews these last 2 weeks knows I've never done anything public. I've never spoken in public before. Right. And now I am 2 weeks later, I'm doing the thing that scares me the most, but more than that, I'm talking to somebody who, just reading your book, Cal, I just came away with such an extraordinary respect for your story. I mean, I knew you were a trailblazer, but one of the things that I think connected us, and I kind of wish we wrote our books together because I definitely went through, it was easy and then it was hard because I felt so much connection to you. And since you asked the question about our immigrant parents and stories and grandparents, I opened my book with my grandmother, who my father came from India. My mother came from Pakistan, both immigrants, I think, like your story. Mm-hmm. And this notion of education being a religion, of sacrifice, the story you tell in your book about going to Gandhi's ashram with your grandfather. Yeah. And, them not talking about, being freedom fighters and all of that. And I felt that very much in my family. My grandmother fought to go to school back in a time in India where girls were not sent. It was shameful to be sent outside the house. And she would get on the back of an ox cart, in the back of the house, not to bring shame to the family. And every time I think about those pinch me moments that you and I have had in the White House on Air Force One, I think about our grandparents and our parents and what they sacrificed to give us this extraordinary life of opportunity. I loved your book so much. So anyway,
thank you. I mean, look, that's mutual. And the whole gushing thing, I mean, aside from going through the book, I also have just been you're somebody who I've admired for years, and you're right. I was one of those nerds in college and especially post-college who would Google, like, why hasn't Huma been doing all these interviews? And then you realize it's because of the nature of the role that you played and the type of public service you've done. And the big one of the questions I wanted to ask you was whether there was, with your parents and the work that you chose, was there a singular moment when, first of all, were they supportive of kind of what you wanted to do early on? And was there a singular moment where they sort of said, I'm proud of the work that you're doing?
Yeah. Well, and I want to get the answer from you also, but my parents, I think one of the most extraordinary things about my parents is that, so when I was 2, I was born in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And I often think about sort of this notion of choice. And my parents, when I was 2, my father was diagnosed with renal failure and he was told he had 5 to 10 years to live. And it's one of the first lines I wrote in my book. My father was told he was dying. And so he went out and lived. And 2 months later, we moved to Saudi Arabia. My parents were both professors, academics. We get on this plane for a 1-year sabbatical, and that was 42 years ago. And even though I grew up in a conservative environment, I think anyone who knows anything about Saudi Arabia was culturally and socially conservative. My mother, in particular, really struggled. She'd left Pakistan to study in the United States, then has to go to Saudi Arabia, and she can't even drive. But they always told me in a community, and this is why I laughed so hard when you wrote this, you could be 3 things in our part of the world: a doctor, a lawyer, engineer. And if you weren't doing one of those 3 things, and if you were a girl, then you could get married and you could maybe, or a teacher, but there were certain circumscribed, professions. And my parents always told me, you can do whatever it is you want. All we require is that you be educated. And I believe my dad, who I was very close to, and he died when I was 17, always thought I would be a writer. He would bring books back from his travels overseas. And one year when I was 10, he brought a book back called Silas Marner by George Eliot. And it was like so over my head. And when I read the introduction, I go to my dad, and I used to call my dad Abu. And I said, Abu, why did this woman, Marianne Evans, have to write under a man's name? And he said, back in the Victorian era, women were not taken seriously as writers. And so she wrote, in a man's name. But don't worry, when you grow up, you'll write your own book and you'll use your own name and everyone will take it seriously, even though it's not that it's a pun on your title, but I think he always wanted to be a writer. And I that's one thing I'm very grateful for. And I'm curious about you, because I laughed when I read the auntie conversations about what college are you going to and what are you doing? So tell me your story and your parents, and whether you had these conversations with them too.
Yeah, look, the focus on education is something that really came from my grandparents. In our case, they, and especially on my mom's side. I mean, my grandparents, on my maternal grandparents, were especially active in the Indian independence movement. They raised us, I was in a Hindu and Jain household, but incredibly secular. They would encourage us to go to mosque or temple or church with anybody who invited us, and really a real Gandhian view of faith and togetherness. And I appreciated that. They also were both teachers, so they made sure that there were never any excuses. My mom and her sisters and their brother had to get as much of an education as it was possible to get. And that certainly was passed on to us. I mean, especially in our case, I think, my dad came here with the equivalent of $12 in his pocket as part of the post-1965 wave of immigration. And I always feel like I have to, the sanitized version of that story is my dad came here with no money and he really made it. And that's true. He worked his butt off. But it's so important to remember that there was a shortage of doctors and engineers in America at the time. And that's one of the real reasons that so many Asian Americans were able to come during that time, that he got into an engineering grad program. That's why he knew that as the American dream and as what it was like to build a better life. So here I come along. I mean, we joked about this in the pre-meeting. I'm terrible at math. Right? My dad's an engineer. My mom has a master's in chemistry. How does this happen? And then I say, I want to be an actor. And, that's not why they moved to America. So their firstborn son can say he wants to be an actor. And I felt a lot of that pressure from the Indian community, in ways that were, they weren't always polite. There were a lot of aunties and uncles who would say things like, are you not smart enough to go to medical school? I mean, look, the answer is no, I was not smart enough to go to medical school, but you just don't say that.
Right.
So it was, I think, what you describe a lot in some of the earlier chapters, in the sense that you have this sense of community or this sense of family. And there are certainly, there's a lot of support there, but also a lot that, I had to work through. And by the way, not to jump too far ahead into our conversation, but when you said the piece about in Victorian times, women who would write had to change their names, I remember in the late 90s, early 2000s interning, there's a chapter where I talk about one of the worst bosses I've ever had, who taught me how not to produce movies. But during that time, I remember that there were screenwriters, particularly women who wrote action and horror films, who would change the names on the front of their script to men's names just to
Oh,
get the script
wow.
read. So when you said Victorian times,
Oh
and I
my
just
God.
think, we often think of Hollywood as a more progressive, more liberal place, and yet when it comes to issues of diversity and inclusion, they've been fairly late to the game sometimes.
Cal, and we are jumping ahead but I want to, I want to go back and ask you something about your early
Yeah.
life, because there were things in your later chapters that did stunned me that I want to come back to. But
Okay.
I love this notion of the Hindu Jain, and that you were going to mosques, because that's definitely how we were raised as well. Curious about both my parents were Muslims. Actually, it's one of the reasons my parents were allowed to stay here in the 60s is because back then, as you well know, an Indian man and a Pakistani woman
Right.
could not have gone back to either country and sort of lived. And that's how they got asylum here. But they really did encourage us and push us to be curious about other cultures and faiths and religions. And I write, and I kind of had goosebumps when I read the opening story in your book about the experience that you had. And I'd love for you to tell us about it, but also because I actually had this notion myself in fifth grade when my father had his kidney transplant. So I went to school in Saudi Arabia. It was a very international school, but people, for the most part, were kind of a mix. There were mutts. Most of us were Muslims. And so I would dip it. America could be this ideal for me, and I write, every time we went on a trip, we would land and I would wake up and ask my mom, is it America yet? Because to me, America represented this ideal. America was freedom. It was choice. It was opportunity. But I do write about this one experience in fifth grade when my father had his kidney transplants. My parents kept us at the local public school in New Jersey for a period of time. And Cal, I kind of struggled. I became the kid. I knew all the answers because I went to British schools in Saudi Arabia, and I found that it was material I learned very quickly, learning that the eye rolling, the nudging, the not understanding the American, sports. I didn't know the rules behind certain games. And it really did make me wonder if my experience, I wasn't the kid bringing, smelly Indian food or whatever, that so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what that experience was and because to me, this was my takeaway, is one of the ways you sort of made your way through was this ability of creating, as you wrote so many beautiful things that I wanted to actually quote, but that you said that you had these stories you told, I opened my book with, I grew up surrounded by stories and I love hearing stories. I'm compelled by stories. It's why I love your memoir. But tell me about storytelling and what stories did for you, and tell us about The Wizard of Oz. Like, I would love just to hear what that experience was like and how you made it.
I will tell you about that. And then it's very funny that you're describing it this way, because I was about to ask you to tell me a story that I loved a section of in the book. And I know, for both of us, when you do press, when a book comes out, at least my experience was, I had no idea what people were going to gravitate towards and what they may not. And there's so many sections in your book that really resonated with me that people haven't been talking about as much, that I would love for you to share. Okay, I'll tell you the Tin Man story very quickly. When I was growing up, you're absolutely right. The town that I grew up in New Jersey was mostly white, but diverse within that whiteness. And what I mean by that is that, a lot of people spoke multiple languages at home. So there was a big Italian American community. A lot of folks spoke Polish or German even. Middle school, there was a huge Jewish community. So every weekend was a bar bat mitzvah in 7th and 8th grade. And so like the Central New Jersey bat mitzvah scene, like I was pretty well versed in. But the bullying, and it's funny that by 2021 standards, it's called bullying, because back then we just knew it as middle school. When kids would kind of beat you up in the hallway or throw your books down the stairs, if you were brown, it was often accompanied with a little quote from either Apu from The Simpsons or Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, some reductionist stereotypical thing that was out there in some of the most popular film and TV shows that kids would watch at the time. And it was the first thing that struck me about, wow, people really, especially kids, like really take those images of what we see on TV and kind of convert them in an interesting way where those images really affect us. That same year, to your Tin Man question, I played the Tin Man in The Wiz. You're welcome. And there's the drama kids would be chastised by the soccer players throughout the year, especially because we were putting up a play. And I went up on stage, and there's a phrase that you might have heard that actors use. I was in the zone. That means the character took over, and you really didn't have full control over what you were doing. That's how into the character you were. At 14, I hadn't experienced that before until The Wiz. So I'm doing this play in front of the whole school. There's a scene where the Tin Man gets his heart, and he's supposed to look at the audience and say, "All you fine ladies out there, watch out." And it's meant to indicate that he's capable of love. Well, instead, I was really nervous, and I went into this zone, and I got my heart, and I said, "All you fine ladies out there," and I did this gigantic pelvic thrust. And then I just said, "Watch out." And the crowd went wild. All the girls started screaming. People applauded. And on the late bus home, all the soccer players applauded and said, "That was so funny. We really enjoyed it. Why didn't you tell us that's what you were doing?" And my first reaction was, I was waiting for the second shoe to drop. I was waiting for the spitballs. I was waiting for that extra thing. And that never came because they genuinely enjoyed whatever their preconceived notions were evaporated with a silly joke that I had made. And that was the first time I kind of realized, well, wait a second, I've seen the downside to these stereotypical representations, but there's an upside to comedy that can bring people together in ways that I never had imagined. And that was one of the catalysts that made me say, I want to be a storyteller for life. I want to bring characters to the stage or to the screen and make audiences feel amazing, beautiful things that they maybe hadn't felt before. And one of the things when I remember transitioning to my very brief public service career, always in awe of yours and always watching everything that you were doing. And we, by the way, this is a total non sequitur, but I know we crossed paths in Iowa and in several other states during the whole sort of campaign process. One of the things that I loved story-wise about your book was when you were an intern. I think it's even in the first quarter, and you write about Ramadan. And you write about sharing Ramadan with people and what that felt like. And even just being an intern and feeling accepted in a way that had not been the status quo in your life up until that point. I had a similar experience when I worked in Washington. It wasn't until I worked at the White House that I felt that, because I felt the opposite in Hollywood. Can you talk about what that was like and what that Ramadan was like and that sort of conversation?
It's amazing. It sounds like you had a tremendous amount of confidence in your ability to tell stories and perform. I think I did too. The only difference between you and me when we were younger is you were clearly very good, as evidenced by your Wizard of Oz experience. I was not. Like I recount in my book, I would stand up at family parties and say, "I have a new poem. Who wants to hear it?" And all my siblings and cousins would be rolling their eyes, and my father would be clapping from the back saying, "That's beautiful, beautiful." And he always told me the greatest power was the power of my pen if I used it wisely. But I fast forward, I did make it to the White House. I walked in as a 21-year-old intern. Now, I do want to note, Cal, that like you, I was rejected from one very, special university that I thought I would automatically be accepted in, which is my parents' alma mater. They met at the University of Pennsylvania. They were Fulbright scholars. But so here I am thinking, I got to follow in my parents' footsteps. I have to go to the University of Pennsylvania. I apply for early admission. Sure enough, I get a very skinny little letter saying I was rejected. And it made me think, when I read your story about ending up at UCLA, I thought this was so similar, because I ended up going to George Washington University for college. And it was exactly the right place for me. The minute I walked in, just before I had left Saudi Arabia for university, I had turned, and this goes to actually what I think is a core theme of your book and maybe mine, but I think really yours, because you've been, such a, you've just been a face out in the world, a well-known face out in the world for so long. But this notion of seeing something to believe it's possible. Mm-hmm. And so just before I left for Saudi Arabia, for college, it was the midst of the Gulf War. This is the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. And I was watching TV, and I turned the TV on, and I see this woman. And the minute I saw her and listened to her, I thought, I'm going to be her. And that was Christiane Amanpour.
Oh,
And
amazing.
for me, it was this
Yeah.
notion of, here I am. I watch women on TV in Saudi Arabia. They're always covered, or you watched, CNN, and you didn't see a lot of people who looked like me. And so she was my moment of, I see that. So you know what? Maybe I can be that. So I land in George Washington University, and thinking I'm at the center of the universe. This is where Christiane Amanpour is going to be. The next Christiane Amanpour is going to be born. And I joined, I think you were similar in this way. I was very curious about different student unions when I was at school.
Yeah.
And so I had a friend that I met through the Black Student Union. Her name was Ronith, and she comes up to me one day and said, listen, I have this great internship at the White House. I interned for Mike McCurry. And, the blue curtain that the press secretary stands at, I sit in the office behind. Well, this was my wow. Yes, of course. I never thought I would get the internship. I fill out the application form, and sure enough, I'm shocked when I get in. And then I walked in, and day one, this is 1996, September 1996. I'm 21. And I was actually disappointed because I was not assigned to the press office. I was assigned to the First Lady's office. And I remember calling my mom from those brick cell phones we used to have back then and saying, Mom, I'm not in the press office. And she says, well, maybe plan A didn't work, but plan B will be, something to explore. And it was amazing. I mean, when you tell the story about bringing Diwali to the White House when you were there, first of all, I'm shocked actually that there was not a Diwali celebration at the White House. So thank you for doing that.
But never with the principal.
The principal.
With the
Okay.
president. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for bringing it to that level, because it should have been. But when I walked into the Clinton White House in 1996, I really felt like I was surrounded. And by the way, Cal, I didn't even know if I was a Democrat. I mean, right. Most of my family in New Jersey, if they voted Republican, as I write in the book, like lots of, South Asians, fiscally and socially conservative. So back in the 80s, you sort of automatically. But I kind of fell in love with the cause, with the mission, the work the First Lady was doing on behalf of women around the world, what President Clinton was doing, particularly with Middle East peace. So for me, like you brought Diwali, we had Ramadan celebrated in the White House. And it was the first time I really felt, like I knew more than people in the room. And it came with a great amount of confidence. And I felt very kind of welcomed and a lot of curiosity about my, cultural and faith values. And I think that was the benefit. Look, I had the honor of working for both the Clinton administration and the Obama administration. I think that was one thing both administrations did really well, which is this feeling of inclusivity and expanding the table so there are more seats. And boy, because when everybody who's watching reads this book, you'll see what Cal, because I really want to hear a little bit more about what you had to go through to be who you became, because there are shocking moments in this book, like when you tell the story about brown face. I mean, I fell out of my chair. And so I love, because every time you're so joyous and so optimistic about the world every time I see you. And you really did blaze a path for many of us. And so thank you. And also, can you share a little bit about that struggle and that experience?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, look, thank you for saying that. I think one of the subtexts of my book, hopefully, is how systems can and do change, and the ways in which that's possible. When I started out as an actor, I remember, I went to UCLA after very dramatically shaving my head after getting rejected from Yale, which I write about in that early chapter. But I ended up going to UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television, and being very excited that I was finally so close to the entertainment industry, so close to people who were working in the industry that I wanted to go at. And so many of my classmates already had agents. They had agents who signed them, and they were going out on auditions, and I wanted that. So for about 2 years, every Wednesday, I would put my headshot and resume together, sometimes with a tape of a student film or an audition tape that I had made, and send them out to prospective agents. And nobody ever called. And after about 2 or 2.5 years, a wonderful actor named Jenna Von Oy, who is still a dear friend of mine, she was on the show Blossom back in the 90s, and then the Parkers in the 2000s. She had a real A-list manager, and she said, why don't I take your tape and your headshot and everything to my manager, he'll at least meet with you and you guys can talk about kind of a good strategy. No guarantee that he'll necessarily sign you, but probably. And I said, that would be amazing. What a big favor. She goes and comes back to me about a week later and said, so he doesn't want to meet with you. And I'm curious if you, how much of the story you want to hear. And I said, look, putting on my, hanging up the artist hat for a second, putting on the business person hat, I'd really like to know everything so that I know what to do differently on my audition tape or my submissions moving forward. So she said, oh, okay, so two things. One, you should know that he really did like your tape. He said you were incredibly talented, and he doesn't just say that sort of a thing. So I just want you to know it's true. And I said, okay, thank you, but I feel like there's a big but coming. And she said, yes. He said, but somebody who looks like you is never going to work consistently enough in Hollywood for him to want to meet with you or even take you on. You know, agents and managers make a commission off of all of their clients. And if you're not working enough, then it's not worth their time. And I was really disappointed for a number of reasons, but the biggest reason was that there was nothing that I could have done differently in my audition tape. There's nothing I could have done differently on my headshot. My barrier to entry was that it was the color of my skin. And I remember being, you know, confused. I remember thinking a lot of things actually. I had a lot more clarity on things like Seinfeld and Friends, two great shows that were very funny shows that were on the air around that time. You have to try really hard to make New York City look that white, right? I mean, there's no doubt that those writers are incredibly talented. The producers are phenomenally funny, but you have to try hard to exclude most of New York City. And so those things started to click with me where I said, wow, that's right. These people are actually making a decision to exclude. So what do I do? What am I going to do to get my foot in the door? And there were, when I finally did land an agent and started working towards those auditions, there were, you know, every audition early on was, you know, can you put on an accent? And to be clear, an accent itself doesn't make for a stereotype. It's the reductionism that generally accompanies those types of things. So, you know, do you have an accent? Where's your turban? I said, well, I'm not Sikh, so I don't have a turban. I had a woman say, well, can you go home and put a bed sheet on your head or something because we need you to look like you have a turban. So all of these things that back in the day kind of beat you down a lot. There were certainly times, I mean, I appreciate the kind words he said, but there were definitely times where I just thought, maybe it's not the right time. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. I have a brain. I can do other things. And slowly over time, making the decision to take some of those roles that I found exhausting or stereotypical to build up a resume in the hopes that things would change down the line were sort of the starting point of my path. And I'm, you know, what I love now, looking back 20 years later, is how dramatically things have changed and how far yet we've still to come or still to go. But there are so many younger South Asian, I mean, not even just South Asian, just actors of all diverse backgrounds who have not had those experiences that those of us who came of age in the 90s had to deal with. And that's a big sign of progress. You know, it's something that I really value. I wanted to ask you kind of a similar question because obviously, you know, as all of those experiences with diversity, the one thing that I didn't personally experience is issues of gender, obviously as a man. And there's a section in the book that really resonated with me when you talk about 2008 and jumping from the loss in Iowa. And obviously it was a, you know, very contentious primary, the unlikeliest two front runners, right? Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. What an embarrassment of riches looking back on that. And going from, you know, the Clinton campaign's loss in Iowa to this phenomenal win in New Hampshire that I think you describe as one of your most inspiring moments that you had the chance to witness with her. I'm curious how that was contrasted with a lot of the sexist comments that you write about hearing and having to deal with. And the reason that I'm asking this, I related so much to this because of the juggling act of, okay, I'm booking a part and it's a phenomenally racist part, but I'm taking it. I'm making the choice to take it. I'm building up my resume. And I was always mindful that when I was doing that, I didn't get the celebration that other actors get when they book those little parts, right? I didn't get the let's all go out for beers with my buddies to celebrate that I have these 5 lines because I didn't feel particularly good about it. And there was a thread of that, obviously completely different world, but there was a thread of that I was curious about how you dealt with this incredible, privileged, inspiring thing in New Hampshire
Yeah.
brushing up against this awfully sexist rhetoric that was coming out around the time. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, so few people ask me proactively about that section of the book, and I'm so glad that you did, because I chose to write in detail both in 2008 and 2016, and actually start with my experience in 2000 when Hillary was first lady and she was running for the Senate. And there was this moment where she was in a debate with a then Republican congressman, Rick Lazio, and he wanders over in the middle of the debate. He marches over to her, her podium, shaking this piece of paper in his hand, saying, insisting that she sign it. And I think of how unprepared we were to deal with. I mean, we're sitting in the green room. We're all sort of looking at each other saying, holy shit, is this really bad? Does he look strong? Does she look weak? Like, we hadn't quite figured out. It was my first, I guess, brush with what it was like as a woman to be in politics. And then 2008, and the reason I write about this in detail, and that was a very tough primary for me, because for all of us, because talk about embarrassment of riches. And those of us who had been in the Senate with then Senator Obama, it was a very warm, close relationship, she and President Clinton. And I'm sure he hates this story, but we were among the people who, when she ran, did an event for him in Chicago, when Axelrod had, her come out to do an event for him, she gets into the car right after we left that event in 2004. This is before the convention. And she calls President Clinton and says, I just met our first African-American president. And then sure enough, months later, everyone sees him at the convention. I felt like, and I feel like in 2008, we didn't know how to handle these comments, even us women. So any people commenting on her jacket, on her clothes. I write in the book, about a Republican, whatever commentator saying, every time Hillary Clinton comes on TV, I want to cross my legs. And we all laughed. Everyone kind of laughs nervously because nobody really knew what to do. And that New Hampshire moment for me, as a woman, I just think of this notion of, this is history that Hillary Clinton has made on behalf of women and girls for generations. And if anything, when you see what has happened since, it just shows how hard it was to do that. And she won that primary. As you said, we saw each other campaigning in Iowa. It was, Senator Obama comes from, behind and really has this phenomenal win, but it was really hard. And towards the end of the campaign, I write a story in the book where, we have this, donor from New York calling and saying, it's enough. She needs to drop out. It's enough. And at that point, I'm so kind of filled with fury where, I react by saying, I'm not even putting her on the phone with him to bully her to get out. But I think in 2016, it's now a, accepted fact that sexism played a part in her defeat. I just don't think we can see people. And I kind of end the book, with a sort of a warning to all of us as Americans, until we start seeing women in a way, until we teach our boys not to be afraid of women's power, to see women as executives, it's still a challenge that we have. And I write in detail all the things that we had to, go through on the Clinton campaign. And it was not easy.
I mean, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but I was horrified, and I knew this at the time when because it was in the news, but like Michelle Bachmann and House Republicans, combining obvious sexism with just Islamophobia in such public ways. I guess my question is, how do you even deal with that? And the reason I'm asking it in that way is I'm hearing you talk about letting a lot of the sexism early on, sort of roll off of you as you're trying to figure out what it even means. Like, are people actually like this until it clicks? What happens when they add Islamophobia to something like that? And when women are doing that too, by the way, it's not just old dudes.
Yeah. That actually didn't even occur to me till you just said it. You're right. I mean, it's this notion, it is one of the big sort of, I hope, a takeaway from my book is the importance of women supporting women. But that moment, and I think you would understand this given our mutual background, we come from a part of the world where your family name, your reputation is everything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you tell a story early in the book about the Sweet 16 party, and, Desi families would jump in the river
Right.
rather than listen to their daughters
Yes.
talking a certain language. So for me, I mean, the reason that was such a horrible experience, when horrible isn't the word. I mean, it was shocking, devastating, enraging, because they were attacking my parents, my family. Mm-hmm. My father wasn't even around to defend himself. And it was complete fake news. And it wasn't just me, they attacked me and a bunch of other, and you've served in government. It was other Muslims in government. And it was all lies. And then we land in Egypt, and Hillary's Secretary of State, and we're at a meeting with these Coptic Christians. And this man says at the table to Hillary, I don't know if we trust you because you have a member of an extremist organization who is advising you. So we're not sure we can trust the Obama administration based off of that. And that's when I had this aha moment of all of these sort of little things that are, you think they're little, snowball into these things. And, Senator McCain went to the Senate floor to defend me. President Obama defended me at the annual iftar, by the way, dinner. And it was amazing to have them defending my family name. But what they were doing was more than that. They were standing up for the values that this country represents and the principles upon which this country was founded. And lo and behold, it was the appetizer. I mean, 2012 was just sort of a drop in the bucket, and my whole faith and community just, targeted in the most extreme way in 2016. It was successful. Sadly.
You write about that beautifully, and you also write, you share, you share intimate things about what those years were like. Obviously, you talk about your relationship with Anthony and how all of that unraveled for you. What's the biggest takeaway that you're hoping folks get from all of those stories? Because I know when like a People magazine is going to write a small column, that they're going to focus on the salacious. But I would guess, having written a book myself, there's a reason behind a lot of those stories. Or is there a big takeaway that you hope that people get from it?
One of the reasons, I don't know if you get this question, but every time so I appreciate that it was not your first question to me, but every time I've done an interview in the last 2 weeks, I'm asked, why are you writing your story? Why now?
Yeah. Right.
And I know in 2016, 2017, when sort of the world was on fire, at least my world was on fire. I think people wanted to hear from me and wanted me to say something, but you get it. You've now been a political staffer. I mean, our job is to be in the background. Our job is to be invisible. Right. We are not the story. And when you're the story, it's actually a bad thing. And I liked being the invisible person. I loved my job. When Hillary Clinton left the White House, I said the day I didn't want to go to work is the day I was going to quit. And that was 25 years ago. But I felt like for so long, everyone else is sort of telling my story. I wanted to reclaim my history, but more than that, I think what I went through with Anthony is actually not that, sadly, uncommon. I think betrayal and heartbreak and devastation is actually fairly, I think a lot of people might relate to it. I just had to go through it on the front page of the newspaper. So if my story in some way can help people, I also happened to be in a relationship with somebody who was battling with what was later diagnosed as addiction. And I, coming from the world of politics where there was such, people didn't understand what was happening. It took us a long time to figure out what was happening. It was really, really hard. And I got to a very, very low place, and I had to power through. I had to get to my lowest place and get some help. And so if I can help, one woman, one person, one Muslim girl, one brown person, I feel like it's a small bit of service I can do. And I suspect to some extent, you probably felt the same way about you. I loved you said something about when you talk to young people, they have the privilege of seeing the world through today's vacuum. There are so many Cal quotes in this book. I could just go on and on that I really loved. But I kind of want to throw that back to you too, is this notion of passing the, your wisdom to the next generation and whether you feel optimistic.
You are the first person to ask me about that quote, that line from the book, and I'm kind of beside myself because I almost didn't include it in the book. I remember exactly when I put that line in. And the reason that I did was I was, in the whole point of sharing all of these stories, like I mentioned, is because I'm so glad that things change, and I love what I do so much, and I love that I have the chance to do it. And I felt like it was important to share those stories. There are some younger South Asian folks who understandably will approach these questions as follows. Do you ever regret, or don't you regret the stereotypical roles that you took 20 years ago? Now it's not really an answer. It's not really a question with an answer, right? Because you're asking it in 2021.
Right.
If you're asking, do I wish I had a magic wand and could go back and play a dude who jumps out of a helicopter and parachutes into a place where I save all the good guys? Well, hell yeah, I would have liked to have done that. But I think, Chris Evans probably did it in his first movie, but that just wasn't in the cards. You have to sort of go through what you're going through. And I mentioned that in that section because to me, that's one of the benchmarks of progress, and I liken it to the time that I spent in the White House, and I assume yours as well, where today you have people who say, oh, well, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, they're such moderates. They're such moderates. They didn't do enough. And I think that's fair by 2021 standards. But also, I feel like if I were a Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, or Hillary Clinton, my answer would probably be, you're welcome. Like, I know that they can't say that, but that's how that progress has worked.
Yeah.
Is if we're looking back saying they didn't do enough. It's like, well, yeah, because now it's your turn to take the reins. Now it's your turn to continue to build on that. So it's funny that you noticed that sentence in there.
Well, no, I one of the things, I just have to read something that you wrote at the Obama inauguration. Yeah. And you said, it actually felt like we fit in. We belonged here. In light of some of my darker experiences in middle school in Hollywood, this was not a feeling I was always used to. Yet here we were, included on a historic patriotic day. And this notion of patriotism, something clearly so special to both of us. I mean, it's a big part of my title is both and one of the both ands for me is that I can be all these things. I can be Indian and Pakistani. I can be an American Muslim and also an American patriot. And I feel like that's a connection that we have together, which is, I loved how you wrote that.
Thank you.
And how did you do all of this in 2 years? First of all, there's no way you were at the White House for 2 years.
What, all of the, I mean, you know this,
everything you were a part of, and clearly working with an extraordinary group of people. I love all the people that you mentioned in the book.
They were tremendous. And look, as you know, from those teams, I was a very, very small part of a lot of those amazing, amazing teams and would never trade that for the world. And I could talk, I have like a laundry list of like 50 questions I want to ask you about your time in the State Department, but I know I'm getting the prompt that we should go to audience questions. And I think your segue was the right one, because you're absolutely right. This idea of patriotism and identity all being one thing and not necessarily having to choose the way that people might expect you to need to choose. I'll ask you this first one that came in from the audience. I guess it's for both of us, but what's the best piece of advice you ever received, and what advice would you like to pass on to the next generation?
So the best advice I ever received was from my father. And he said, you told me when I was a little girl, your eyes are at the front of your head for a reason. And that's to look forward and not to look behind you. And I think, my dad wanted me to study history, but I think he wanted me to study history so that we learn from the past and not make future mistakes. And the advice I like to pass on to the next generation is advice I did not follow. I write a chapter in the book where I make a decision 25 years ago. I'm at a family wedding and I get a call to go to Argentina for work. And I took the trip to Argentina. I always picked work and family always came second. And I, sacrificed a lot of time with my family and friendship. So I always say, quoting my dad again, a good life is a balanced life. Try to find balance in your life. Wait, what about you? What is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
So I hesitate saying the best, because then you offend people who gave you good advice, but I remember in those early days when I was trying to be an actor, I went to, I think it was the Screen Actors Guild had a conversation with a woman who I believe at the time was the only Black actor on network TV.
Hmm.
And one of the questions from the audience was how she deals with typecasting, but also how she deals with rejection, something that surely every actor has to deal with regardless of the color of our skin. But when you're a performer of color, it's magnified. And she said something that you said a version of in your CBS Sunday Morning piece, which I really loved. She said that she knows that she needs to be overqualified for everything. That's just the reality. She knows that she is trained classically in theater. She's she's done Shakespeare. She knows that when she goes up for a movie, the casting director and producers know that. And if they want to hire somebody else who maybe looks a little more mainstream, who looks like they're from Iowa, who doesn't have as many credits and doesn't have the training, that she knows that they know that that's why they hired her and that that's the best that she could do. Now, in my case, the reason that resonated with me was I was carrying so much anger around at things that I couldn't control. And she was just basically outlining how to channel that anger into something that would be useful for my career. Obviously night and day, but I think it was the last quote in your CBS Sunday Morning piece was about, and I'm butchering it here, but it was about being exhausted by being angry.
Yeah.
And that just spoke volumes. We have our lives are so different in this regard, but I really related to that so much. And I think so many other people could too.
It's beautiful. Thank you. Wow, you watched my CBS Sunday piece.
Absolutely, it was amazing. I told you I'm a big fan. Okay.
Okay.
There's another question. Okay, this is also for both of us. So we both worked in government. I mean, this is already phenomenally unfair because Huba literally has a legacy of service. But okay, can you talk about the country's current state of polarization and what do you think might be needed to bring our country back together? That's a question that I always struggle to answer. So I'll let you go first.
I struggle to answer it too, in part because, I'm going to date myself here. Well, actually, everybody already knows I've been in public service 25 years. But, I do believe, so first of all, I think this administration has their work cut out for them. They inherited a mess. I think of all the things, unfortunately, very often, I think about all the things that would have been different in our country if Hillary Clinton had been elected in 2016. Mm-hmm. Things like the reaction to the pandemic. And I don't believe as many people in this country would have died. I think the response would have been much better and more efficient. I think this Afghanistan withdrawal, we would not have been in a situation. People, blame the Biden administration, not realizing that they did not inherit a plan. They inherited a deadline, and they did the best that they could. And the good, from my perspective, like I remember Tony Blinken when he was like the cool NSC guy down the hall dating Evan Ryan, who was like the pretty, scheduler, and Ron Klain when he was in debate prep after debate prep, for multiple candidates. And I remember being around the world with Jake Sullivan and banging on his door and saying, Jake, it's 3:00 in the morning. We're in Moscow. We haven't eaten. Like, let's go get a meal. The reason I tell these sort of connections is I know these people. We know these people. They're patriots. They're trying to do the right thing. It's a really hard time to get anything done. And to me, I don't believe it's why I write in the early part of the book, my dad really believed, and it was important talking to the other side and fellow Muslims would say, don't go into these conversations where even the angels fear to tread, but you have to be in these conversations. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything done. So my opinion is the only way we're going to get stuff done is figuring out a way to be in a room. Compromise, unfortunately, is our reality, to the point you made about both President Obama and President Clinton and Hillary, I don't know how we do it any other way. I don't know how standing in the corner, yelling and screaming or setting ourselves, we want to get things done and we need to get things done for our country. And I think that is the only way forward.
Yeah. I mean, look, you said that way more eloquently than I could. The only thing I would add is I remember when I was the president's liaison to Young Americans, President Clinton invited me to speak at the Clinton Youth.
Oh, right.
Miami.
Of course.
And I had the chance to have dinner with him and several other leaders afterwards. And he said, I want to recommend a book to you. It's called The Big Sort by Bill Bishop. And by the
Oh,
way, for
sure.
everybody watching, you have to read our two books first, but then add The Big Sort by Bill Bishop. It's a wonderful book. And he said, it talked about and mind you, this was like 2011. It talked about how America was getting more and more polarized and how people are choosing where they live based on a number of factors, including who thinks like them, and how dangerous that could be, and how much that worried President Clinton. And I've thought about that so much because in my short time in government, certainly I tried to apply that lesson. Thankfully, my boss, President Obama, but also Valerie Jarrett and Tina Chen were adamant that in the public engagement office, we truly brought in people who didn't necessarily agree with the president. And a lot of times they were farther to the left, and a lot of times they were way farther to the right. One of the best examples I can remember of this is conversations around climate change, where there were young evangelicals who were so passionate about climate change who came in and met with people who were far to the left who didn't think the president was doing enough. So to your point, I mean, that type of coalition building, you don't have to agree on every single issue,
Right.
but that type of coalition building is the only thing that's really going to move the needle forward on particular topics or particular issues. And I'm actually pretty hopeful that we can still do that as long as we turn off cable news, and it does feel amazing to like tweet something really angry at the person you disagree with, but it doesn't necessarily move the needle on anything.
Well, I came of age. I amen to everything you just said. And, I came of age in politics back when, cable news, it was the 24-hour news was a thing. And now it's 24 seconds. And I think one of the biggest lessons we learned in 2016 is that this notion of these stories that seem so outrageous, we just wouldn't even respond because they seemed so crazy. And now it's not responding. Essentially, you're, accepting that, perhaps it's fact. I mean, I just think the amount of information that is being thrown at our, certainly our children. It's concerning, but that's why public service, I end my book this way, which is to me, it's like the worthiest. And even for you, it feels like it was kind of in your blood and you sort of fell into it by happenstance. Like, didn't Olivia Wilde have to like convince you to go to your first Obama event?
Yes, the story is that is true. I was on House at the time with Olivia, medical drama. And she knocked on my dressing room door and she said, hey, I have a +1 to a Barack Obama event. Do you want to come? And I said, no, I don't. She said, well, I saw you reading his book. And I said, well, yeah, I read his book. That doesn't mean that I want to go to an Obama event. And this was October 07. So he was still 30 points down in the polls. Senator Clinton, John Edwards were leading by far. And I just said, I'm not, I was remembering my grandparents, it's all about public service.
Yeah.
It's not about politics. And she finally convinced me to go. And I go to this event and Olivia's standing next to me. All I knew was it was going to be about 50 artists. And the senator was going to make the rounds basically asking us for help in Iowa. Can you come to Iowa to do some youth outreach? And I knew that people were going to ask about arts education. They were going to ask about cultural diplomacy, things that artists ask about. So I went home before the event. I looked up the campaign website, the climate change proposals, and I saw there was a big section about how Obama's plan to invest in corn-based ethanol and what that was like. And I remembered, this also shows everybody what a nerd I am. I remembered that a few months prior, there was an article in Foreign Affairs, a magazine that I subscribe to, that the Council on Foreign Relations puts out, that talked about how investing in corn-based ethanol drives up the price of corn as food for people in developing countries because the system doesn't differentiate between corn for industrial production and corn for consumption. So I thought, well, this is my question. I'm going to ask a smarty pants question in a room full of artists. They're going to ask about the NEA funding, and I'm going to ask about climate change. So Obama's making the rounds, and he comes over to where Olivia and I are standing, and he says, "Hi, how are you?" And I said, "Senator, I have a question about climate." And he goes, "Oh, okay." I said, I read your climate change proposal. Investing in corn-based ethanol, isn't that just going to drive the price of corn up in developing countries? People won't be able to feed themselves. And he looks at me and he smirks and he says, "Oh, yeah, I read that article in Foreign Affairs too." If you read my plan carefully, you would see that I'm investing in corn-based ethanol as a bridge to cellulosic ethanol so that you can make, fuel with things like grass clippings and leaves when you mow the lawn. And he walks off and Olivia says, "You just got schooled by Barack Obama." And we both signed up to do just one volunteer trip, but that was the thing that initially kind of got me into into that campaign. And then the reason that I tell that story, and go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, then you didn't even know how to apply for a job.
I didn't. The reason I tell all of these stories, they're obviously very self-deprecating, but
yes,
it's that there are so many people. I mean, once I got to Iowa, I was so impressed that whether you were on Team Obama or Team Hillary, or frankly, there were like 10 other candidates at the time, there were so many people who were doing that because they genuinely believed in taking a break from whatever, or adding on to whatever their job was, taking time to volunteer. I mean, I remember when I even as recently as 16, when I was working for the Clinton campaign, we would get on planes and there were people who were in their 60s who were volunteering, people who had taken, I just took a week off of my job to knock on doors in a battleground state. People do this sort of a thing and we don't hear about it as often, and it's deeply inspiring. So that's why I wanted to write about it and make fun of myself a little bit in the book.
No, I think it's great. I write about it in my book too, this notion of it's hard to describe that feeling, that adrenaline when you're in those rooms, in those gymnasiums, the sense in those town halls, walking, the sense of possibility, the optimism, I start my book with saying my parents, they knew America wasn't the perfect country, but it's sort of the ideals that it represented. And there's just something about being in that place and space where it is so rewarding, feeling like maybe you can help somebody. I mean, think of the stories, people's stories and problems and hopes that you carry in you. Like they're like precious treasures for me that I've collected over the years. It's been a real honor to be able to do that.
There's I know we only have a couple of minutes left. There's a question that came in that I've gotten a few times actually when on my book tour, and I assume you have as well. While writing your book, did you learn anything new about yourself?
Oh, did I learn anything new about myself?
Yeah.
I think it really forced me to think about, things I didn't really want to think about, like, the Iraq War, like really exploring how I felt, this notion of, and also that I think I'm this really terrified, shy, scared person, but I actually like writing and I like sharing my story. And I don't know, maybe it gave me like a sense of like self-confidence that I wasn't sure I had, if that means anything, kind of as an overall experience.
I love that because mine was the opposite. I remember turning in, so I'm used to writing scripts and screenplays and creating silly characters.
Yeah.
This is the first time I've written something that wasn't a policy document, but was still nonfiction.
Yeah.
And I remember turning in my first couple of chapters to my editor and feeling this weird self-loathing that I haven't felt since I was 15 years old and wondering why. And there were so many, I mean, it went through different iterations, obviously, and I got it to be that balance of funny and serious that I wanted. But those first several chapters, even talking about things that I had laughed about over beers with friends, that when I finally put it to paper came out way more dark than I thought they would be.
Yeah.
And I realized, I said to my editor, I know you're not my therapist, but I feel like I'm getting way more out of this than with my therapist, that
I say this all the time.
I'm processing this stuff.
Yeah.
And I was very thankful. I learned that about myself, that maybe I should, do stuff like this just for me a little more often.
I don't know why, Cal, the line that you write about the scene where your back is about to be put on fire and the safety or the stunt coordinator comes up to you and says, "I'm here to make sure you're safe." And he's got a scar on his face. And the way you write this story, I'm like, how is this person the stunt coordinator? And he managed to let that happen. It is so, anyway, you write beautifully. And this story is like really, I feel like, I hope we've both kind of done this notion of, sharing our truths, talking about, we both talk about race and identity and faith and struggle, and hardship, but also like these crazy experiences we have. For some reason, as I grew up in Saudi Arabia. I thought it was so weird. So there were only two channels in Saudi Arabia. Channel 1 was Arabic news. Channel 2 had a couple of shows in English. You know what the two shows were? At the end of the day, after we fasted during Ramadan, we'd run and watch two shows: Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
Oh, wow.
And Full House. Okay. In Jeddah in the 80s and 90s. I'm not joking. You write about both those shows.
Both shows, yes.
And I think Will actually has a book coming out maybe this week.
Yeah.
Will Smith, the first time Will Smith was on the state floor for like a big black tie dinner. And I'm standing there thinking, I've now met everybody. I'm so like, I'm nothing can shake me. And a man says, excuse me. And I turn around and it's Will Smith. And I literally was speechless because, he was so connected to my childhood as like, oh my God, that's Will Smith. And I think he was like asking me where the bathroom was. It wasn't anything more profound than that. And I was speechless. I mean, we've had a lot of pinch me moments, haven't we?
We have. That story reminds me of my dad meeting Tiger Woods at the inauguration. It was such an uncle moment for all the Macy's who are joining us tonight. But I prepped my dad before inauguration. I said, there are going to be tons of people you're going to meet backstage. Please, if you want to meet anybody, if you want to take a picture, please tell me first. I'll make the introduction. And he was so offended. He said, I know how people treat you when we're out sometimes. I would never do that to anybody. We go into the inauguration tent. It's a green room. It's, beautiful. Everyone's very nice. I turn around to put my bag down. I look back, my dad is gone and he's all the way across the tent. And all I see are these flashes from his camera, his old school camera. He's taking pictures this close to Tiger Woods. And I pulled him away and I was like, Dad, we literally just had this conversation. Why are you doing this? You said that you wouldn't bother anybody. And he just looks at me like I'm the biggest dummy in the world. And he goes, yeah, but that's Tiger Woods.
Hello.
It's like, oh, okay. All right. Excuse me.
I totally get it. I have a story that got cut from the book about my brother when he had his little baby girl, and he lives in the UK, and we get there and President Clinton was still president, and my brother wants to take a picture. And so he hands this crying baby off and he hands the phone to a man saying, can you take our picture? And the man takes a picture with the camera. And then when we leave, I turn to my brother. I'm like, that was Tony Blair, like Prime Minister Tony Blair, who you asked, like he was so how people just get into the state when they're around famous people. I'm sure you're used to this all the time. So my brother has a photo with himself and Bill Clinton that Tony Blair took and that he didn't realize. So
that's hilarious. They're telling me that we only have time.
I have so many questions left for Cal, but okay, we have.
I know, me too.
All right. So what is your 60s? Oh wait, you're supposed to ask. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I mean, I guess we ask each other, what's your 60-second idea to change the world?
My idea is not going to be original after you've heard this conversation, which is we need more women at the table. If we had the same number of women at the table, the world would be a much better place. What about you? You're going to have something.
True. No, mine was actually yours. Yours is actually a real thing. I think mine's going to be a little eye rolly.
Oh no, eye rolly is good.
But it's to talk to people who disagree with us.
Yes.
I think that the polarization is painful and difficult, and we all have that crazy uncle at Thanksgiving, and I don't have Facebook anymore, but to the extent that was toxic, looking at the walls of all the people you went to high school with and the things that they say or don't say, the simple conversation over a beer, that thing that you can connect with people on, I think is just such a special thing. It's one of the things I love about sports. It's what I love about comedy. It's what I love about having an actual dialogue with somebody. So that would be my answer to that, is just talking to people who disagree with you. It's
beautiful. You couldn't have summed it up more perfectly.
Whom I feel like we could talk for. We should talk for hours. By the way,
Dude, we should have basically done it should have been like the Cal Huma Road Show. I mean, I so enjoyed this conversation. I love talking to you. And
same here. Same here. We should do more. Obviously, want to thank everybody who joined at Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. We want to thank the Bernard Osher Foundation for supporting tonight's Good Lit event. If you would like to watch more virtual programs or support the Commonwealth Club efforts, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Cal Penn. This is Huma Abedin. We just want to say thank you so much. I hope you enjoy both our books. They make great gifts for Diwali, Ramadan, and the upcoming other holidays. So thank you, everybody. Take care.